humans have always asked, how are we different? How are we modern? But just because we live further along the historical timeline doesn't mean we're separate from the things that happened further back. In this series, we invite you to set aside that chronological notion of modernity as a point on the timeline. We invite you to think instead about the kind of experience that the word modern is meant to reflect. The term modern does indicate a difference between now and then, but the difference doesn't simply have to do with time, whether we're living before or after that dividing line in history. It has to do with our experience of the world. Bluetooth and colonialism and secularization, these all have to do with some novel quality of our experience. We use the term modern to express our sense that we are inhabiting a time in history that, to our minds, feels markedly different from the times that came before. But people were also expressing this sense back in the ancient or pre-modern world, in cultures that existed more than a millennium ago. We can trace the word itself back to the Latin modernus, which we find as early as the year 490. In the 550s, the Roman intellectual Cassiodorus was engaging in what we might call modernity talk. He drew an explicit contrast between modern times and the olden days, meaning everything before the fall of the Roman Empire. The past is different from the present, in so many ways. It's legitimate to speak the language of modernity. But there are limits to the usefulness of modernity talk. Let me give you an example. I work in a Gothic skyscraper called the Cathedral of Learning. Parts of the building resemble a medieval European cathedral, but it's also 40 stories tall, which would be impossible to achieve without steel, a very recent invention. In 2023, I walk corridors built a century ago, modeled on monastic cloisters built a millennium before that. The Cathedral of Learning is a great image of how the past occupies the present, and the present occupies the past. It gives the lie to that common conception of time we often fall into, the conception of time as purely linear. The timeline tells us that the Qin First Emperor is a long way away in linear time from the construction of the Cathedral of Learning in 1929. But the timeline obscures how it is that I can sit in my office in the Cathedral of Learning and learn from the Qin First Emperor. Linear time reduces everything to pure chronology. It's unidirectional. You can only go forward, never back, and one point on the timeline can never meet with an earlier point, or learn something from it. This podcast draws on the insights of literary scholars, art historians, philosophers, theologians, just plain historians, and others to help us see more clearly how the past is still with us and how we might work with the past to repair its wrongs and discover new resources for flourishing in the future.